Bueno, pues...
Well, thank you all for being here tonight. My name is Paula Corroto. I'm a journalist from El Confidencial, and I have to thank you to say thank you to the publishing house and also Fundación Telefónica for allowing us to have this meeting and this conversation with the author Douglas Kennedy, who, at least to me, is the first time I'm holding an interview with so many people in the audience since March 2020. So I'm very grateful to have so many people around and to have a conversation with a writer coming from abroad. And it has only been very recently that we could say this. So it makes me very happy that we can all be here today and resume this type of meetings, this type of debates with people coming to visit us from outside of Madrid or Spain. I will make a brief presentation of Douglas Kennedy. Maybe you know him and you have read his books, but I will make a brief introduction of him. His both North American and Irish, and he was born in New York in 1955, but his relationship with Ireland started when he was very young. He went to study in Dublin to the Trinity College, and then he came back to the States and to Ireland, and he was captured by the world of theater, and he started working in the off-Broadway scene in the 1970s with experimental plays, and in 77 he decided to go back to visit some friends in Ireland, and he stayed there for several years, setting up playwrights and working with different theater companies. And this is something that for us who have read his books have seen it in his novels, like in the books that we have here, like in The Pursuit of Happiness, about a young man writing playwrights and in the 1940s in the United States. The theater also led him to start writing nonfiction books, and he started with some travel books. The first one was written in 1988, which is Beyond the Pyramids. That was travel that obviously was around Egypt, and after that he travels to London, where he starts working as a journalist and he starts writing novels. And the aspects that interest him the most, and I will tell you a bit about the topics that he usually deals with in his novels. His books have a great welcome by the audience. I was reading some data about his biography. He has sold over 14 million books throughout his life. Of all the books he has written, he has actually written 24 books up to date, and that's quite a career indeed. And we have some of them here. They started being published in Spain at the beginning of the years 2000, and since 2018 the publishing house ARPA has resumed publishing his novels, such as The Pursuit of Happiness and Isabel in the Afternoon, which is the last one that we have that has been published, and you can find them all in the bookstores. But this is the last one that ARPA has published, where he deals with emotional, personal, and love relationships, and especially in this case, he talks about a young man and a somewhat older woman who start having a relationship in France, and everything that this type of relationship might entail. Aside the success of his novels, some of them have been taken to the movie theaters with actors as important as Kirsten Scott Thomas, for instance, who have made the movie The Woman in the Fifth. So he is also well known in the cinema world, in the movie making world. His I would like to talk with him about the topics that he covers in his novels. He makes a portrait of the American society in the past 70 to 80 years after the Second World War, where and aside the story of the characters that we can see, what we always see in his novels as an underlying topic is the political, economic, historic context, and we can see how society was absorbing and enduring all these changes, and the way they have influenced the societal imagination, how this affected the minority populations, etc. It's also to be highlighted the role of women in his novels. All his feminine roles, to me, are very spectacular, because the view he has on these characters is very interesting. He can feel like a woman in the face of certain situations, and to me, that involves a storytelling exercise that really requires a gift to make us see through the eyes of a woman. Also, in his text, we can see the clash against the Puritanism in the United States. Now that he lives between Paris and London, he also has an outside of very European North American, and so he has a different view of the relationships between people, women and men, etc. Because there are some differences between the views in the United States and in Europe, and I think we can talk about this also today, and I think it's very interesting. Another thing that is very important in his books is the family. This is a pillar within his novels. These are not happy families. Sometimes they are very complex families. They're not exactly unhappy. The fact is that relationships within family units are complicated, between siblings, between parents and sons and daughters. It's not usually the happiest one you can imagine, or the easiest one. And also, I would like to talk about where the United States is heading to right now, and I would like to ask him about the role that the United States will have in the future after having Trump and now having Biden as a president, and also with the cultural wars, etc. So without further ado, we can start our conversation. I think I've spoken too much already.
And I'll say this at the beginning, there is no such thing as a happy family.
Exactamente. Es complicado, es complicado.
That's right, it's quite complicated. To start with, in your novels, there's always a conflict, whether family related or emotionally related. There's always, however, a context, political or social. We see the 40s and other decades after that. Why are you interested in showing this political and social context to be included in your novels?
I'm taking these out because I'll go out of my mind if they stay in. Thank you for that very nice introduction. When I was at university, I read history. And I remember wanting to become a historian. I was training in that direction. And my tutor actually won a prize for the best thesis at university. And my tutor said, "You write really well and research is clearly something you like, but do you want to spend your life in a library? I think you're a man who wants to be out in the world living," which was absolutely right. What's interesting for me, and I think essentially, you know, when we talk about the family, you have to go back to the beginning of literature, which are the Greeks. So you have to go back to Aeschylus and Sophocles. The family has always been crucial, but the family also, if you look at the Oresteia, you know, it's a mirror of society as a whole. And essentially what I've tried to do in my books is, you know, frequently look at family as this eternal conflict, but also your country as a larger sense of family. And it's interesting, I lived from 1977 till 2011 in the US, in Europe, and then returned to the US with the idea that I would always have a foot outside of it. I have a thesis about life. I speak as a man who's been divorced twice, and that's it, by the way. But, I always think life is much easier with a round-trip air ticket when you know you can leave. But fundamentally, I always felt, even with 33 years in Europe, America was my subject. America was my argument. It's one of the reasons I left Dublin after 11 years. I said this to someone, it's an interesting place. It's too small. The Irish also love to stab each other in the back quite a bit, and they turn on you if you're there long enough, as I found out. And also, it wasn't my argument. Your country is always your argument. And in terms of the family, I think, fundamentally, you can explore a great deal about a culture, just even looking at a couple, which is what I do in Isabel. I mean, it's a young American who's 22 years old, who meets a French woman in a bookshop who's 36. He's from the Midwest. He has no experience of life. He's traveling in Europe before going to Harvard, a lonely man from a very loveless family. She is a French translator who's originally from the provinces but has married well. Very much someone of the 1968 spirit. Le 68 Arts, French is my other language. And they begin this affair. This afternoon affair. And what you see is an American sensibility meeting a French sensibility in bed.
¿A dónde va la familia?
As you say, family is not always the same. Families evolve as countries evolve. So where is family heading to? If we think about the United States and if we think about Europe, where would you say families are heading?
It's very interesting. I'm on the left in America, you'll be happy to hear. And I think two things I'll say. One, I feel the American century is finished, and we are now essentially in decline as the world power. I think in the future, probably when I'm dead and my children are in their late 40s, they're in their mid-20s now, mid to late 20s, I think China will be the dominant player. And that's going to be a very different story. I think also, fundamentally, what you see in American politics, there's always been this great discussion about the family. And how, family values, that's a word that the Republican Party uses all the time. Democrats really don't have family values because they like gay people, Democrats don't have family values because they're in favor of a woman's right to choose what to do with her body. That's not really family values. And, and Trump was a sort of Trojan horse for the Christian right. He understood to get elected. Even though this is a man who dated porn stars and probably paid for, I would imagine, at least 20 abortions in his lifetime, he had as his vice president Mike Pence, who was a very fundamentalist. He's a Catholic, but he's very fundamentalist Christian. A man who called his wife mother, which I found very bizarre. But nonetheless, Trump embraced this. And there is a culture war going on in America right now. It's a huge one. There are two Americas, and we can't stand each other. And I firmly think, the whole notion of family is being fractured as well, because, frankly, the way we relate to each other is so different from even 20 years ago. I don't want to get onto this, but we were living through a technological revolution. I am one of those people who, in a way, wishes the mobile phone never arrived in our lives. It's very useful. I'm a music nut. I can book tickets for an orchestral concert, which I'm doing on Sunday morning here, Mahler's Second Symphony with the orchestra from Madrid, and I can book for the Berlin Phil and all that. But fundamentally, there's no privacy anymore. And have you ever just noticed how everyone looks at their phone? And people have stopped reading because of this. So this has also been a fracturing of family as well. It's a very different world we live in. But as a novelist, it gives me a hell of a lot of material.
Además, a mí me llama la atención porque
What calls my attention is that family is a recurring topic in the storytelling in the United States, whereas in the Europe is something that we don't deal with so often. And in Spain, for instance, is a topic that we don't talk about, nor even in the political discourse. Why would you say that the Americans have been talking about the family for years, for decades, and this is not the case so much in Europe?
I think it's a larger issue. Le Monde in France asked me to write a piece the year that Sarkozy was running for the presidency. And I've lived in France 20 years. And as we say in New York, I'm dumb, but I'm not stupid. And the last thing I was going to do was write my feelings about Sarkozy or French politics. You have to be an idiot as a foreigner to do that. There are rules. But what I did write about, I said, why is there no social novel in France? It's interesting because the French invented the social novel. I mean, Flaubert did this with Madame Bovary. But when you think about Zola, when you think about de Maupassant, when you think about Hugo, and that basically dropped away in the 1930s, and certainly after the war, the French began to write kind of anti-narratives, what they call the nouveau roman. I think in America, we have our experimental writers and some great ones like Pynchon and most especially Herman Melville with Moby Dick, which is probably one of the great meta novels ever written. I think it's up there with Joyce's Ulysses, and Homer, and Tristram Shandy and several others. But American fiction is very rooted in a realist tradition. And why the family? I mean, again, go back to the Greeks. Look at Shakespeare. It's always about the family, because the family, even when Shakespeare is writing in the history plays about kingship, look at King Lear, which is not a history play, it's a tragedy. But it is essentially about a father edging into dementia and 3 competitive daughters, fundamentally. It's always been there. And I think, again, if you want, as a writer, and I'm interested in this, in holding up a mirror to, the way we live now, you have to start with the family, or you have to start with the couple. Because we all come out of families, and also most of us at one time or another have been in a couple, or have been in a couple repeatedly. There are people like that too. And again, that dynamic is interesting. I've often said 2 people in a room and you have politics, one way or another, and you also have power going on. I mean, even in, most couples, in a way, there is, even if it's very subtle and even if it's very loving, there is a negotiation at work all the time. That interests me.
Antes hablabas de...
Before, you were talking about 2 types of the United States, which is also 2 different types of outlooks on family, one more traditional, and another one where we can think of other factors like LGBTI families, or mixed races families, and other types of families. And this is something that at the moment is not so it's not so visible in Spain. There are 2 forces that are clashing. There is not a conflict between a more traditional family and a less traditional family. Within these 2 forces in the United States, which one of the 2 would you say is becoming more predominant? Do you think that the traditional family is still working at the moment, or would you say that the new family is also rising right now?
It's interesting because I've just published a novel in English, which ARPA will be bringing out, I think, next year, called Afraid of the Light. And it's very different. Every time I write a book, I try to change completely. I think I'm a schizophrenic, but I've never tried to write the same book. I have the same themes going on all the time, but I like to change it. But it's about an Uber driver in Los Angeles, a man out of work, who drives right into the middle of the abortion debate, which has gotten very ugly. And I mean, Texas has passed these laws that are medieval and ridiculous. The fact is, and this is interesting, I think, on a demographical basis, the United States is changing radically. And much good has happened in the last 20 years. Gay marriage, frankly, the legalization of marijuana, I'm in favor of that. But also, at the same time, abortion is probably going to be federally banned within the next 10 years. It might happen on a state-to-state basis. And there are a lot of people in the country very much working hard towards overturning the separation of church and state, which was enshrined in our Constitution. And I began life, as wanting to be an American historian. I think, also the Republican Party have done their best through gerrymandering, through voter suppression, basically of trying to, frankly, cheat their way into power, and they have succeeded. That is absolutely true. So on a certain level, I'm pessimistic. I think Joe Biden is a parenthesis. And I think, I would not be surprised if there is another civil war. It might be a cold one, not a violent one, but I would not be surprised if actually... The thing is, I'm from working class people in Brooklyn. My daughter now lives in the area where my father was brought up, and, that was a tough Irish Catholic neighborhood. My mother's German Jewish, so I'm Jewish, very proudly of that, from Flatbush, which was petty bourgeois Jewish. Where my father lives now, my daughter has an apartment there, and it's bobo, if you know that expression, and when my father was growing up there during the Depression, you could not get, a cortado, and people did not wear edgy glasses. It was priests and cops and, tough streets. I think, I grew up at a time in New York and in Manhattan, and I was born in 55, so I'm 66 years old. And I remember when basically there was a middle class in the city. This has changed completely. It's completely vanished. When there were little bookshops everywhere, over 150 cinemas in Manhattan alone. There are 15 left. I mean, this is another thing, I was just walking through Madrid, and I love going into neighborhoods, and, anytime I see independent shops, especially bookshops, but, I'm pleased, I think there's still a degree of that here and a touch of that, but I think something else sort of larger is going on, which is the fact that, and I think this is something that informs a lot of my fiction, you frankly either have money in America or you're screwed. It's as simple as that. I wrote a movie a year for 6 years to pay for my children's university education so they wouldn't get into debt. Most of their friends came out with $200,000 in debt. How do you start life like that? But these are kind of, the issues that no one is really addressing at the moment. So, I do feel very glum sometimes about my country. And yet at the same time, when I'm back on Sunday night in New York, I will go to the Village Vanguard, the world's greatest jazz club, and we have great orchestras, and we have great museums, and we actually have a very interesting national literature, and there is still a dynamism there, which I believe in. And the United States, despite what you might think, is full of very smart people, you know, and there are people who will wait for the new Almodovar film, for example, you know. I grew up, I was a cinephile. I would always wait, when's the new Carlos Saura coming out? I remember, you know, his film was in the late 60s and 70s. And Buñuel, lots of us are very cognizant of world culture, but we're about 20% of the country.
Eso lo vemos mucho en las pelis.
Hang on, sorry.
No, te estaba diciendo.
I was saying that we see that very often in Woody Allen's movies, that you have so many smart people that are reflected in Woody Allen's movies about New York, for instance. But we read your novels and we know that the United States is a society that in the 1960s and 70s, where we could see discourses about the feminist movement and the freedom of women's rights and the rights of minorities, and this was going on in the 1960s and 70s in the United States. So what has happened since that we see now this complete changeover, and this is not the country where we saw these drives, these liberal and progressive impulses come from?
When I was writing The Pursuit of Happiness, which is a novel set in 40s and 50s America, but it's also set in the 1990s because there's a modern story that runs in parallel with it. I was very interested. My chief character, Sarah Smythe, is a journalist and editor in New York in the 1940s, and she's decidedly single. She never has children. She has an affair with a married man, which segs into McCarthyism. I won't explain why. And she has a brother who's a very successful television writer and gay, which you could not be in the early 1950s. I was very interested in looking at a time, which was my parents' generation, when you could not be a single woman and accepted. If you were a single woman, my mother got pregnant at 24 with her first child, me, and that was it. She worked in television, and that was it. And I grew up in an apartment of 65 square meters with two parents who were at each other's throats all the time. When I saw Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf for the first time, even though that's an academic situation, I thought, that's it. I grew up with that. That was my childhood. And I watched my mother, who was an educated woman, but really, as I sort of see now, she was suffering from manic depression. And fundamentally, she never knew who she was. And she got talked into a life. And she didn't even get talked into it. It was basically, this is what you do. This is what you do. I was at university in the 70s, both in the States and then in Dublin, and a lot of my women friends of that era, did go down the post-feminist road of children and giving up the career. I knew others who didn't, very successfully, and others who remained single without children. From an early age, because of the parental complexity, and my father was away a lot, and this is something I talk about in The Symphony of Hazard, which is also known as The Great Wide Open in English. My dad was an executive with a copper company in New York, and he was running mines for them in Chile. And the night before I went to Dublin, in 1974, he took me out to a Japanese restaurant near his office. He was back from Santiago, and basically we started to drink, and my father was someone who liked to drink a lot. And also he was very much not in vino veritas, but in vino stupidus when he drank. He talked too much, which was fine. because even at that age, this is a writer's habit, I was very interested in asking questions. And during the course of this evening, he said, what do you think I've been doing in Santiago for the last 4 years? I said, well, you've been running a mine in the Quique in the north and coming back and forth. And what was revealed to me was that my father was an agent in the CIA. And he had been one of the people who had helped, you know, the Pinochet regime take power. And I grew up with this guy who used to come into New York with my father, who I used to call Uncle Joe, not like Stalin, but his name was Joe Sibley, and it turned out he was the head of Santiago Station. He was the CIA honcho in Santiago and plotting the coup d'etat. And my father's mistress of the era was the daughter of Pinochet's foreign minister. So he was really implicated. I remember telling this to a girlfriend of mine in Dublin some months later, and she looked at me, and she was Marxist, so she was horrified. And I said, well, she said, aren't you ashamed? I said, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? You know, that moment, it's funny how these things come into your life. I think that's when I started realizing all families are secrets, and you don't really know, you know, the things that have shaped you, which is very much behind the pursuit of happiness. But also, when I think about it more and more as an older man now, I think the main reason my father joined the CIA was to get away from my mother.
Él quiere hacerte una pregunta.
I would like to ask you a very direct question. What's the problem with in the United States with sex?
What's the problem with sex in the U.S.? Historically, we began as a Puritan country, very much so. I said this once on National Public Radio during an interview, and I think someone said, are you out of your mind? But I basically said, you know, as Americans, we were brought up with the idea that our forefathers, they were called the Pilgrims. I think there are two Americans who are nodding a lot with me, and they were called the Pilgrims. And they were not the Pilgrims, the people who came over from the United Kingdom in the 1620s and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were, frankly, the Taliban of the 17th century. They really were. I mean, when you read about, you know, people being hanged for blasphemy, for preaching Quakerism. There's a plaque in Boston Common for a woman who was hanged for preaching Quakerism in 1636 or something like that, burning people accused of sorcery, of witchcraft, and also a very fundamentalist view of life. Not, if you know your philosophy, not Locke, but Hobbes. Man is in a fallen state. He will never be redeemed. You can do this through hard work. And also the fact that sex was dirty. The first great American novel is The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, who, like me, went to Bowdoin College, a very good school in Maine. And it's about a woman accused of adultery in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in Puritan times, who's forced to wear a red A on her tunic, showing her that she's basically you know, a fallen woman, which it turns out she isn't. She's wrongly accused. So there's always been that aspect of it. And there's also, I mean, it's interesting. I've lived now, you know, as I said, over 20 years in Paris. And when I was writing Isabelle in the afternoon, and I came up with this idea of, the French are fascinating. And I know this, you know, having had relationships with a variety of French women and also having lived among them and mastering the language. Everyone says that France is a romantic country. The French are romantic. Absolutely not. The French, like their greatest philosopher, they are Cartesian. Cogito ergo sum. And they believe very strongly in compartmentalization. So there's this idea fundamentally in French life, and it still exists too. It's changing now, but certainly of the generation I'm writing about in Isabelle, but it's still there to an extent, the idea that, you know, you meet someone, you fall in love, they're the right person. There's also kind of a socioeconomic, you know, kind of, shall we say, meeting of similar worlds. That was always very important. You create the family, you build this essentially structure. But there's also the idea that after a few years, you know it's going to become routine. So how do you maintain the structure? You have other rooms that you go into. And one of the rooms that people have traditionally gone into in France is what's known as le 5 à 7, the 5 to 7. This is where you meet somebody in the afternoon from 5 to 7, generally married, and maybe you're married or not. I've been on both ends of the equation, I'll admit. And you see each other for a few hours. So either if someone has an apartment, fine, or you borrow someone's apartment, fine. You might meet in a hotel. There are hotels in Paris that rent, you know, by the hour, exactly for this. And you have 2 hours together. Someone usually brings along a bottle of champagne, and it's very passionate, and then you go back to your lives. You tell this to an American, and I don't want to generalize, but you tell this to a lot of Americans, and there's horror, because the whole notion of infidelity is one which is bound up in personal honor, good character. You know, I heard someone once talking about someone who, you know, was discovered having an affair. He cheated, you know, and it's worse if a woman gets caught. That's, you know, even now there's, you know, it's like, okay, men are men, but a woman doing that, my God. But that's Madame Bovary. Flaubert wrote about this in the 1850s. So for me, with Isabel, I was interested in actually having an American who knows very little about life and not much about sex. He's not a virgin, but he certainly never had, you know, a relationship as intense with Isabel, falling into this 5 to 7 for a while. And actually, also, I wanted to write a novel where sex is a very positive thing, which I think it should be. Margaret Mead, a great American anthropologist, said sex is the highest form of human communication. I think she's not far off the mark there. But these two people at the beginning, physically, it just works. And it continues to do so over 35 years because they don't live together. Because it is a relationship outside of the normal committed relationship that one has the day in, day out, you know. And again, they both bring to the table their respective cultures as well. But for me, I felt that was very interesting. And, you know, personally, I'm someone who, you know, I don't judge people morally. I mean, clearly, if it's someone like a Harvey Weinstein, you judge them morally. But in terms of, you know, when I hear, oh my God, someone's had an affair, that bad person, I go, you don't know what goes on. And that's the interesting thing. I mean, a marriage, a committed relationship, you know, people, when a divorce happens, people are always talking about, she did this, she was a bitch, he was a bastard, da 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 da. The fact is, there's no truth here. There's just competing narrations. And also, you never really know what goes on with a couple because you're not in their bed.
¿Y no crees, Douglas, también que este concepto de infidelidad del que...
Don't you think that this concept of infidelity that you're talking about in France, also in Europe, is now being questioned?
I think the generation behind me, I see rules being played in different ways, and yet not at the same time. I think probably, you know, I don't think things change that much, to be honest. I fundamentally believe, you know, it's a bit like It's a bit like drugs. You can prescribe drugs, but people are going to find a way of taking drugs, so you might as well not. You can prescribe. You can kind of make prostitution illegal, and people will find ways of having sex with somebody and paying money to do so. I mean, that's human nature, and frankly, I think people are always going to, want to step away from monogamy. Gesundheit. Yeah, we were speaking German earlier. People will always want to step away from monogamy. Not all the time. I mean, people go, oh my God, how can you say that? Well, it's true. It's absolutely true. I'm someone, as a writer, I never try to judge in a moral way. I'm not interested in, and this I think is very wrong, and it's something that's kind of fundamental in the United States, but everywhere these days where political debate is so shrill and so angry, and it's I'm right, you're wrong. And the fact is, unless you're getting into the very big moral questions and things that are evidently wrong, the Holocaust, genocide, rape, I mean, fundamentally, when it comes down to the relationship between two people, it's usually very gray. There's no right or wrong. And as I said earlier, always, they're competing stories. And as a writer, I like that gray area and looking at it and not trying to judge, but also trying to understand. I think in Isabel, what is also interesting is it posits the idea that basically these two people who clearly have an immense love for each other, maybe are in love with each other, the balance of power over the course of the relationship changes. Isabel has it all in the beginning. She's the older woman. She's married to an older banker, a man in his 50s, who's prosperous, grand bourgeois, as the French would say, and has bought her this little apartment as her office. She's a translator, but clearly with the knowledge that she will probably want to take a lover from time to time, and that's okay because she'll stay with him as he has his mistresses. And Sam is this complete innocent, and he's going, if we make love like this, how can you not say it's love? And she says, I'm going home now to my husband. I'll see you here on Friday at 5 o'clock. And then it changes as all relationships do, and the balance of power changes. And you see two people over the years where there are moments where one of them wants it and the other pushes away, even though they both know it's right. And I've often wondered, when I write a book, I don't really know what it's about until I finish it. And one of the things that I found myself intrigued by when I was working on the second draft was maybe subconsciously both these people understand that it's so precious and it's so powerful that the moment they become an official couple and begin to live together, it will change. And to do that, they need to keep away.
Quizás.
One moment, I'll find it eventually.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe a word that is key in what you're saying is the balance, a relationship between two people who are equal. I don't know if you see it that way. Right now, it looks like we're questioning this as if personal relationships were not in terms of equality, but that there's always one person who is more prejudiced or more hurt than the other one. Would you say that there's a wave of conservative thinking that might be arriving in Europe coming from the States? What would you say?
I was reading something the other day, this is a digression, about a very well-known Chinese composer named Wright Sheng, who fled Mao's Cultural Revolution and took up residency in America, and I think he's won a Pulitzer Prize. And he's a professor of music at the University of Michigan, an excellent university. And basically he was fired the other day because in his composition class, he wanted to talk about a certain aspect of music and film, and he showed Laurence Olivier's Othello when Olivier was playing Othello in blackface. And people objected, and they said he was basically, approving cultural appropriation, I think is the term, etc. I found this horrifying. Maybe it wasn't maybe he should have introduced it and said, this is how it was in the 1950s, etc. But there is, even on the left, I think in America, a kind of strong, shall we say, correctness, which I fear verges into the totalitarian. At the same time, I'm much more frightened of the right in America, the Trumpite right, than I am of, the radical left. I think, right now, at the same time, I think Me Too, even though there probably have been some people who've been wrongly victimized by it, it's been very necessary. I do not know of a woman, friend of mine who has not in one way or another been harassed in an aggressive way. My daughter as well. So I think, that is important. I think at the same time, everyone's very nervous right now. Everyone is very nervous. You have to be very careful what you say. You really do. And, fundamentally, a wrong comment can cost you a great deal. And that is tricky, That is a very, very tricky thing. I think, is there a new wave of conservatism coming from the States? I think fundamentally there's a new conservatism everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. I don't think it's just coming from the States. Personally, this is the historian in me, as also the novelist. And I wrote a novel which I don't think has been published in Spanish yet, called State of the Union, which is about, basically 60s America and then the America of George W. Bush after 9/11. I think 9/11 changed everything. I think historically that will be seen as a real line of demarcation, and we're still living with it. And I mean, if you think now, and I mean, in Europe, there was a point in, let's say, the late 80s when, my God, it looked like sanity had won, The dictatorships here and in Portugal were gone. The Stalinism of the Eastern Bloc of the Warsaw Pact was gone. The Berlin Wall had fallen. It was, conservatives of that era seemed very much conservative light. And it was the time of Clinton and of Tony Blair. Think now, 30 years on, when basically we had a Mussolini in power in America for 4 years, Mr. Trump, and he wants to come back, and I think he has a good chance. When you think of Erdogan, when you think of Orban, when you think, I forget the name of the Polish right-winger who's in charge, when you think of the anti-immigration parties everywhere, this is all post-9/11 stuff. It really is. And so I think, and also when you have a lot of people very much being very, very unnerved, especially in the United States, by what I call basic civil liberties. I find, the next novel is about abortion, but I find the way that the Christian right have focused in on abortion as it's misogyny. you cannot give it any other word. It's misogyny. It's saying to a woman, and I speak as a father of a 25-year-old woman, you really should not have control of your own body. Abortion still is existing in America, but it's changing very rapidly. So, I mean, I think, it is, I feel, a very worrying time. I have no solution to it whatsoever. I was clearly cheered, like most of the world, that Biden won in 2020. I think the Republicans are going to do their absolute best to, make sure that doesn't happen again, and that they win the Senate and the Congress again in 2022. I think also I lived for, good Lord, 23 years in London. And as an Irishman, I voted all the time, always for Labour. But, there, the Labour Party has been out of power now for over 11 years. They're in disarray. They don't know what they're about. I knew Boris Johnson as a young writer around London, because he's a little younger than me, even though he looks a little older. And, I met him a few times, and I always thought, this guy's a clown. He's the Prime Minister, he's the Prime Minister. If you had told any of us in London in the end of the 80s and the early 90s, when I was just getting published and I was a young writer around town and also doing a lot of journalism, that this idiot was going to be Prime Minister, this kind of, public school boy, this old Etonian, there we are. So it's a complicated moment, to say the least.
Y ya para terminar, antes de daros entrada.
Just to wrap this up, before we open the mics for questions from the audience, I would like to ask you how to fight Trumpism.
Read.
I'm sorry.
Read. I think that's the other thing as well, because anytime I see someone on the metro, or on a bus, or on a plane, or in a cafe with a book, I want to hug them. I want to say thank you for actually still reading. I'm thank you for basically supporting my métier. I am someone who, the only way you fight Trumpism is the only way you fight any sort of fascist front, and that's, I think, the E word, education. I'm obsessed with education. I grew up at a time when public education was good in the States. It's since Reagan onwards, it's basically been cut back so heavily. My grandfather, who was a jeweler, my maternal grandfather in the Diamond District of New York, I always remember he never finished secondary school. He was in World War I, and he was a member of something called the Book of the Month Club, which people probably from the States, where you signed up, and it was like $2 a month, and you got 2 books a month. And my grandfather usually read about 3 books a month. There was still that kind of sense. I'm not trying to be even nostalgic, but I think, education is important. Culture is important. Culture is not for the elites. Culture filters down. In the 1960s, Leonard Bernstein had these televised concerts. I went to 2 of them as a young kid in New York for the young. This is not about, it's classical music, but honestly, my daughter, when she was in school and was not very happy in school, but she used to be teased by children as the girl who reads. I think the future really, if we are to have a future where it's not people staring at phones, and also education allows people to question. It teaches you how to think. And I think this is very crucial. And it also teaches you to be discerning, whatever level, and not to buy in. Populism is about listening to the person with the loudest voice in the room and who sounds most persuasive in the most simplistic way. Make America great again. As I said, Hillary Clinton didn't have a slogan. He had that slogan. It was empty. And even, and basically, half the country bought it. And even some educated people bought it as well. So, I mean, fundamentally, yes, education. I think that's the only way we can do it. And that's not easy.
No, no es nada fácil. Vamos a ver.
It's not easy indeed. Let's see what happens. Well, I would like to open the mics for the Q&A. I think that we have heard very interesting things about the current situation in the United States and where Europe is heading. So would anyone like to ask a question or say something?
The books, we seem to have talked largely about America tonight, but that's okay.
También.
Yeah.
Obviamente.
I'm happy to talk about America.
Obviamente.
Yeah.
No sé, alguien.
Who's going to start?
¿Quién rompe el hielo?
Who wants to break the ice? Go ahead.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. I will be asking my question in English since you're going to get the translation. Thank you very much for being with us today. My question is about, well, actually I have two questions. One of them is about your last book, about Isabel, and the other one is about the movies. About Isabel, I would like to ask you what part of fiction and what part of reality there is in the book. What I mean is, have you based your story in a true Isabel to tell us your story? A French woman that you might have met and that might have confessed to you while having a few drinks her true story? Or is it fully fictional and there is no model to have based your book on? And is it pure creation and pure literature out of your mind? That would be my first question. My second question would be, as I'm an actress myself, and I would like to ask you why the only 3 of your scripts have been taken to the movies and not all the books, because I find them so interesting and I think that they would all be made into movies. And obviously this one, because the story of Isabel, I'm really eager to see it in a movie. So I would suggest that you suggest this idea, and thank you very much.
I'll answer the second question first. For a writer, you know, the cinema and television is like the casino. You know, things get optioned and they rarely get made. I think I've written 14 novels and also 3 for children, which are also in Spanish now. And basically, 3 of my books have been filmed. That's actually a pretty good record among my novelist friends, you know, to have had 3 movies made. I hope more will happen, of course. But it's, you know, it's such a difficult and crazy business, the film business. I've written adaptations of my books. There was supposed to be a film of Pursuit of Happiness, directed by Olivier Assayas, and we had Rachel Weisz and Colin Farrell in the 2 roles. And then at the last minute, you know, Olivier got another project, and this is how it happens. I'm very happy when it does happen, and my attitude, I've always said this to directors, you have carte blanche, because if it's good, well, I will profit and I'll help you. And if it's bad, I'll still cash the check. And I have my novel, so it's sort of a win-win. In terms of, you know, everyone always wonders if you've written it, you must have lived it. So I've been asked this a lot. Who is Isabel? You know, did you have an experience of this? I don't really talk about my private life publicly. What I will say is there have been several Isabels. Take it for what you're... But Isabel herself and the character, I've made her up completely. This is something that's very important. In France, there's something called autofiction, which is essentially you take what happened to you and you write it. there are a couple of people who specialize in one woman I was on a talk show with, who I frankly think was, I said to someone afterwards, men are stupid when it comes to sex, but you'd be really stupid to sleep with her, because, you know, she will say all, you know, and everything that was not good. I can promise you, because I'd read one of her books, which I found ridiculous. What's interesting to me, and maybe this answers your question, I function like a sponge. Everything interests me, everything. And when I meet someone, I'm also often asking questions and trying to also get a picture of that person at the same time. One, because I'm interested, and two, it's also a kind of professional, shall we say, conduct on my part. And even if the story, I would, basically Sam in the novel is not me either. I'm not from the Midwest. I never was a lawyer. I didn't grow up in that background. Having said it, it's an extremely personal book, because I brought a lot of my own feelings about relationships to it. There are aspects of me in Sam, just as there are aspects of me in Isabel as well, but it's not my story. And I think that is interesting, because if it's not your story, you can actually find a certain truth by it not being your story. Not the truth, because there is no truth, but a certain truth, a certain verity, by stepping back. But of course, everything that has happened to me, I use. You know, a girlfriend once said to me when we were breaking up, she said, you know, are you going to write about this? And all I said was, never sleep with a writer. Thank you. Hi.
Por allí. Ah.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon. You say that you trust education culture to fight totalitarianism, but what happens when Nobel Prize, a literature Nobel Prize, such as Mario Vargas Llosa, says that it's not important to vote with freedom, but to vote right. That is to say, to vote to the right-wing parties.
I mean, that is a genuine problem, and we saw this in Nazi Germany, for example, you know, when basically education was completely shaped to, you know, adoration of the Führer and adoration of the Aryan, you know, race. So, I mean, that's there. But the question was vis-a-vis the context of, you know, of someone like Trump. I mean, you know, that is a definite problem. I mean, you had a similar problem in a different way in communist Russia, you know, in the Soviet Union. And in East Germany. I wrote a novel called The Moment, which is I don't think it's in Spanish yet, I hope it will be, which is set in the former East Germany, you know. And I have an apartment in the former East Berlin, in Prenzlauer Berg. And, you know, you hear stories constantly about essentially all East Germans basically had to espouse the party line. They had to express loyalty. This was taught in schools, you know, socialism is right, capitalism is bad. People were encouraged to spy on each other. And basically there was complete paranoia, because in a way the state set up the system which basically said you can never be completely faithful to us because you're human and you'll have doubt. You know, this is a big problem in all totalitarian systems, whether on the left or the right. You know, everyone has doubt. Doubt is, you know, I think doubt is something that's good to be taught, because doubt also makes you question. And it makes you go, wait a minute, you know, I don't know if I believe this. So you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, if, you know, fundamentally, and you see this in Iran, for example, which was, before the revolution, it was on a certain level the most cultured and secular of countries in that region. But the Shah was a monster. He was a dictator. But what did they get in return? They got a theocracy, and a very brutal one. Iranian cinema is very interesting. There's a great new film called There Is No Evil, which is about the death penalty in Iran, and is one of the most upsetting films I've seen in a long time, and was shot clandestinely. But there, you know, this is the great problem as well. Education is used constantly by, you know, dictatorial regimes, you know, to promote their own agenda. It's key. I have no answers, you know, but you're right. Thank you. Good question. You know.
Tardes. No sé si se escucha así. Hola, buenas tardes.
Hello, good afternoon. As a writer, you're very productive, and I would like to know if you have ever experienced a creative crisis, and how do you train your creativity?
The only time I have ever been blocked was when I gave up cigarettes. And that was in 1986, and I was writing my first book. And I coughed up blood one morning. I was smoking 2.5 packs a day. I was crazy. And I coughed up blood one morning, and I went to, this is in Dublin, and we had a house that wasn't heated very well. And I was newly married at this time. I went to the doctor, who basically sent me for an x-ray and did some tests and said, you know, you're fine, but, you know, you keep going, you'll be dead at 40. And I stopped. And I had a real block for about a month on the book I was writing, my first book, which is, I still smoke. I smoke 1 cigarillo a day now, and I kind of inhale it. It's a little, you know, I know it's dangerous, but it's not 2.5 packs of cigarettes a day. That's the only time I've ever had a creative block. What I will say is, after, you know, why have I written so many books? There were responsibilities like children and a family, and I don't come from money. There was the after effects of divorce, you know. I don't think any of that's wrong. You know, there's this notion that if someone writes fast, I've written a book in a short amount of time as 4 months, The Woman in the Fifth, which I wrote when I was having insomnia and I realized my first marriage was failing, and I spent a lot of time in Paris at that point, and it's taken me as much as, you know, 2 years, which was The Pursuit of Happiness, but never more than 2 years to get a first draft out. Usually about a year to 18 months. So I actually write fast, and I'm also doing journalism, which I still like doing. I still write regularly for Le Monde. I'm an essayist with them. And I still write for the New Statesman in the UK, and I probably do a screenplay or a TV thing every year. I like to work, and the reason I like to work is because it's the one thing in life I can control. You know, you can't control other people, nor should you want to. You can't control how life will turn out for you. You can hope your career will go in certain directions, but there are sometimes, and I've had them, setbacks and reversals of fortune. What you can do is write every day. And that's something, it took me a while to kind of get in the rhythm of it, several years. But now, I work all the time. I mean, the other day, my, wonderful press attaché from ARPA, Christina is sitting over there, and we were doing interviews in Barcelona, and we got back to the hotel. We were doing a morning radio interview, and I had an hour, and I just said, I'm going to go hide, and I grabbed my laptop, and I came down into the hotel lobby and had my 4th coffee of the morning, and I wrote about 300 words. And, I did this afternoon as well, before I came here. Writing is a very daily event for me. And it's something I try to do 6 days a week. And anyone who says this is the way to do it, they're a liar. There's a very famous English novelist of the 1920s and the 30s named Somerset Maugham. And he had the best line I've ever read about this. He said, there are 5 basic rules for writing a novel, and nobody knows what they are. And I fully agree with that. For example, I was talking about Flaubert. Flaubert had a family heritage. He didn't have a wife, he didn't have children, he had mistresses. He had a niece who eventually kind of ruined him financially, but he could take his time and he was slow. He wrote 100 words a day, which is maybe half of a typed page or half of a page in Word. I saw the first draft of Madame Bovary when I was in Rouen. I was brought to the Bibliothèque Nationale and he rewrote endlessly. The other extreme, a very famous Belgian writer named Georges Simenon. Anyone here read Simenon? Great, great crime writer who wrote 300 books during his lifetime. 300. He also bragged about sleeping with 10,000 women. I know his son. We're friends. I think probably in 9,850 of those cases, money exchanged hands, but that's a digression. But Simenon could write 40 pages a day. 40 pages of manuscript a day. He was, and you know, André Gide said he was one of the great Francophone writers of the 20th century. And at least 30 of those novels are exceptionally good. Me, I use the same method that Graham Greene and Hemingway used. I set myself 500 words a day. That's about 2 pages on Word, or 2 typed pages when I used to write, you know, with a typewriter. And I do that day in, day out, minimum. Right now I'm up to 1,000 words on the next book I'm writing. Why does that work? Well, 2 pages, you're not, the big problem, my daughter has just finished the first draft of her first novel, and there was a point when she called me from New York and said, you know, my daughter was raised in London, so and she's still very English, even though she's lived in the States for 6 years. She went, you know, Daddy, I don't think I can do this. And I said, well, I'm going to give you some tough love. I'll be upset about that. You'll be upset and no one else will care. And she went, God, that's tough. And I said, yeah. She finished the novel. And the fact is, you know, no one does care whether you do this or not. So you have to do it for yourself. And what I like about 500 words, it's basically, it's copable. It's not like trying to run a marathon. It's a little jog. And if you do it day after day after day, 6 pages a week, 12 pages a week, if you do it by 2 pages times 6, at the end of the year you have a first draft. It's a way of doing it. The other thing I will tell you is after 24 books, every book I've written, I've thought somewhere in the middle of it was complete crap, okay? When you write, doubt is your neighbor, in permanence. I went on holiday in Greece at the beginning of September, and I put away the novel I was writing for 3 weeks. And I came back to it and read it through and had this complete crisis about it. And I realized I hadn't figured out what I was going to do with the next half of it. And last week in Berlin, where I lived part of the year, quietly on my own in a cafe, I sat down and for 3 hours just outlined. And suddenly, I don't know if I'll even use it. I then threw it away, but suddenly something started again, and it's flowing. But my point is, writing is a very lonely activity. You do it by yourself. And I've often said to younger writers, if you don't like being on your own, don't do this job. Because you are on your own, and the biggest thing you have to cope with is your own sense of doubt. And even at my level, it's still there, and will always be. Good question.
No sé si tenemos tiempo para...
Yes.
Bueno, yo tenía dos preguntas muy concretas. Una...
I had two very specific questions. The first one, it called my attention that in your last translated novel, the protagonist was a journalist, and now you're revealing to us that you have worked also as a journalist, or you work as a journalist. So I would like to ask you if there's any learning from this professional side of you that you can incorporate into your novels, and also thinking about the latest literature Nobel Prize coming from Tanzania. I would like to ask you, your literature, your writing reminds me of other writers from the United States, and I would like to ask you if you think that there is any American writer who would deserve the Nobel Prize and that has not received it yet, and also what's your view on the writing that is going on at the moment in the United States, and what type of writers or what writers you like?
When I started my career, when I was in Dublin, and it was 1983, and I started as a playwright. I wanted to write plays. And I had a few things done. I even had a couple of radio plays on the BBC. I was okay, I wasn't very good. And basically to pay the rent, and so this is 1983, I started writing journalism in Dublin. And even Dublin, a small city in 1983, had 6 daily newspapers. It's hard to believe, isn't it? 6 daily newspapers. Wow. And I ended up as a columnist on the Irish Times, the main one, which was like the El País of Ireland. I lasted there a year and a half. A new editor came in and fired me, which basically got me finishing my first book. When I got to London with my first book in 1988, I didn't realize it at the time, although I did soon. It was a sort of a golden age. There was a lot of money. You know, London was not an expensive city, more expensive than Dublin, but not much. And, you know, there were 15 daily newspapers in London, 15, you know, and the BBC, and a lot of magazines, literary reviews, and they paid not badly. And you could actually create a life as a freelancer. And I would write my journalism in the morning. I would, you know, go for a walk, and I'd write my next book in the afternoon. And I did this for years until I wrote The Big Picture, and I didn't actually have to do journalism so much. I still love doing it. I just did a series for the Journal du Dimanche in France, where I wrote 10 pieces of a road trip I took. I've even in the middle of COVID, I've managed to do 23 foreign trips. It's very funny, this morning I had my 18th PCR test here in Madrid, my 18th, you know, and I was saying to Christina as we were on, and this one was the first time where it was saliva, you know, and I was put in a room and told to fill a vial with saliva. Do you know how hard that is? And she looked at the saliva and said, "When did you last drink coffee?" And I said, 35 minutes ago. She said, "That's okay." But literally, I was sort of waiting all afternoon, even though you know, I'm vaccinated and all this. You know, I literally got the negative result 30 minutes before I came here. But, you know, fundamentally, I did this road trip in America this past winter where I drove literally from Wyoming up through Montana to Fargo in North Dakota to Minnesota, and then up the east coast of the United States. And I did 10 2,000-word pieces for this newspaper. I still like doing it. I think what I learned in journalism was many things. How to ask questions, how to be curious. This is something that also, I think, in terms of education is very important, but just in terms of life, you know, I'm still very curious, enormously. And I'm also, I'm fascinated immediately. I mean, you know, one of the first things I did when I came to Madrid was thought, where are the jazz places? You know, I went to a bad one last night, and I'm going to a good one, I think, tomorrow night called Cafe Central. You know, I'm immediately interested in how much things cost. I'll always look at the prices of property because you learn a lot, the devil's in the details. That's also a 19th century approach to the novel. And also, I mean, the other thing is, and I think it's an interesting thing in journalism, is taking the individual and looking at it also in terms of society and how a story can reflect that. So it's not surprising that a lot of novelists start as journalists. You know, I forget what the other part of the question was. Oh yes, writers in America. Excuse me. I was really pleased. No, I remember now. Thank you. I was very pleased that that Tanzanian writer won. Most of the time with the Nobel Prize, it's not an evident person, but it's someone who's been working quietly for years. What was very moving to me. He's lived in Britain now for, he's about 7 years older than I am, but he's lived there probably for 50 years. He's 73. And he was shortlisted for the Booker Prize once and longlisted, and he's had a career which no one knows anything about. And we're at a moment in publishing where writers get dropped all the time. It doesn't work. And his publisher, Alexandra Pringle, stayed with him. And I thought that was wonderful. And again, this is a writer who, in the current economic situation of publishing, probably would have a very hard time getting started. And that's bad. Among the Americans living, I thought Louise Glück, who won last year for poetry, was a fantastic choice. She's a great poet. The writer who I felt should have won the Nobel Prize, he died in 2018, is Philip Roth. I think he really deserved it. And, people said because of his perceived misogyny, which I don't think was there, kept it from him, And interesting, there was an entire scandal with a member of the Literature Committee whose husband, of the Nobel Prize, whose husband was accused of rape. But was she someone who kept Roth out? I don't know, but I think he deserved it very much. I think Murakami should get it. I think he very much deserves the Nobel, but we'll see what happens next year. But it was a good choice this year. It's always interesting. It really is, because it is, John O'Hara, a very famous novelist of the late 20s and the 30s, a very difficult man, but he used to call the Nobel Prize, he said, "I want the dynamite money." Do you get that? Yeah, because Alfred Nobel invented dynamite, and he realized he gave the world something that was very destructive, and this is where the Nobel Prize came from, basically, the dynamite money. I always like that. Anyone else?
Yo creo que ya no podemos tener.
I think we do not have the time for more questions, but thank you so much for being here, for participating. And I just wanted to add that you will have the opportunity of having your book signed at the entrance, and he will be pleased to sign your books. So thank you so much, Douglas, for this conversation, and thank you everyone for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Te conduzir o mundo.